The traditional method of Western scholars or critical scholars for introducing the origins of Islam has been to follow this account, but, in a word, to take God out of the equation, so that the historical outline is retained, but critical scholars, by virtue of their vocation as scholars who don't, in fact, take the possibility of divine intervention in human history as a proper method of scientific research, they would look for other motives that form the experience of the Prophet Muhammad in Mecca and Medina. And their manner of doing so has led to three problems, I think, and this is the reason, essentially, these three problems in the traditional approach to origins of Islam that leads to the importance of a new approach, which is what I try to accomplish in this book. The first problem is the Western approach, the critical approach to the origins of Islam, because at the one hand it's based on the traditional story, and on the other hand it takes God out of the equation. Traditionally it has led to a portrayal of the Prophet Muhammad by which his character generally, according to these traditional Western scholars, generally becomes, in a sense, corrupted or becomes less holy by virtue of his increasing involvement in worldly affairs. Many Western scholars would argue that in the Meccan period, Muhammad was preaching a pure religion, a simple religion, preaching of God and the day of resurrection and calling people to repentance. But as he gained more followers, and especially once he traveled to Medina, where he began to establish that Islamic state, he began to be concerned with worldly things, and that this somehow affected his character. The second problem for this traditional approach of Western scholars is that, in fact, historically, outside of the Islamic sources themselves, which tell us his traditional story, we don't have historical documentary evidence for this account. None of our early sources from those years, 610 to 632, the traditional dates of Muhammad's prophetic career, in fact mention the Prophet Muhammad or mention the rise of this new Islamic state, other than the Islamic sources themselves. So as historians who have sort of critical methods to work with in establishing what can be seen as tradition and what can be seen as fact, historical fact, we don't have a lot to go on. Thirdly, the third problem that causes us challenge for understanding Islamic origins is that, according to this biography, we have Muhammad in first a pagan city, and then a city that's at once Jewish and pagan. But when we look at the Qur'an, which is, according to Muslim belief, the record of all the things the angel Gabriel told to Muhammad, and indeed, according to scholars, our oldest source for the origins of Islam, the Qur'an itself has great concern with matters and traditions that were familiar not to Jews, not to pagans, but to Christians. It seems to debate constantly the character of Christ. And in some cases, it tells versions of stories that could only have been of interest or known or familiar in a Christian context. Not only does the Qur'an speak about Christ and Mary explicitly, but even when it speaks of items from the Hebrew Bible or the Old Testament, it seems to do so in a Christian way. For example, in the story of Adam and Eve, although Eve is not mentioned in the Qur'an relates that in the Garden of Eden was Satan. Now, if you read the book of Genesis, you'll see that the book of Genesis relates that Adam and Eve were in the Garden of Eden with the snake. It is only Christian tradition, already evident in the New Testament and the book of Revelation, that identifies that snake with Satan. And in the later development of Christianity, that's a constant theme, that it was Satan who was in the Garden of Eden with Adam and Eve. Judaism develops differently, and as a rule identifies the snake simply as the most clever, as Genesis puts it, of all animals, but not Satan himself. The Qur'an then seems to reflect a Christian understanding of the story of the Garden of Eden. Elsewhere we find stories in the Qur'an which are only known from Christian tradition, and the best example of this perhaps is a story found in the beginning of chapter 18, which is the story of young men who fall asleep. This story is not known in Jewish tradition, but it was a story that was exceptionally famous in the early Christian world, the story of the 7 sleepers of Ephesus, and it tells the story eventually how these 7 young men fall asleep, and eventually they meet the good Christian emperor Theodosius II. So the Qur'an itself seems to have Christian connections, and yet the traditional story doesn't provide us with Christians. Now, sometimes Western scholars have imagined that Christians might have entered into Mecca or Medina, even though there's not good traces of them, or maybe some Muslims, when they were traveling, maybe to Ethiopia or elsewhere, they brought down Christian reports. But very often, it seems like scholars are searching for a way to connect the Christian material of the Qur'an and the biography of the Prophet, where Christians play very little role. Is there a better approach to Islam origins? I think there is.